you very much. Now, can everybody hear me? Okay, good. I'm not good at microphones, but I'm going to do the best I can. Louder?
Do we need it louder? Apparently louder, Joy.
Better?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, good. All right, so this is my introduction, and I wanted to start with this because this is how everything that I'm going to be talking about, this is how it all began, are with these two voting registers at the city of Fredericksburg. So my name is Joy O'Toole. As you heard, I'm the Adult Services Programmer at the Howell branch in South Stafford. And I'm here today to tell you about one of our local heroines, Janetta Fitzhugh, and her impact on Fredericksburg and women's suffrage in the early 20th century. I'm also going to cover two other influential people who worked for suffrage from Stafford County itself, as well as suffrage in whole, because if you're like me, you may know only one or two things, and this opened a whole new world for me. So I had not heard of Janetta Fitzhugh at all. I had not heard of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. Has anybody here heard of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia? 1, 2. Yes, okay, like me. So you guys are gonna learn too. This is what happened to me. I had no idea. So I knew kind of the real basic facts of women's suffrage in the US, but that's it, nothing else. And some of you may even know more than I did at that point. But it all changed because in 2019, July 2019, I started a local history course with the George Mason, specifically for public librarians. And the point of it was to take a piece of, a book or an artifact or something like that from local history and put it on, you make it a digital archive and build the context of what happened historically around it. And so I went down to the Virginiana room, as one would do in this kind of case, looking for a historical artifact that I could use, and talked to Nancy Moore, who at that point was the Virginiana specialist. And she and I were talking, and it was 2019. She said, well, next year is 2020, and that's the centennial of women's suffrage. And we just happen to have the city of Fredericksburg voting registers that they gave us, and they include the first women who ever registered to vote in the city of Fredericksburg. I was like, aha, okay, so here is my topic. And so I started scanning them. I think they sent a few of the scans around. It's not complete. There are 4 books for the women, and I'm working on the last one now. I'm doing it with a phone, so it's very slow. We don't have a scanner that works for this kind of thing. They're very fragile. They're locked up, and they're very fragile, so you can't put them in a regular scanner or anything like that. So anyway, that was kind of the beginning of my search for something to do. And as I was looking at the history of women's suffrage in Virginia, and specifically in this area, I uncovered the name of Janetta Fitzhugh, who I had never heard of before. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of background on women's suffrage generally before we get into her life. So in 1848, we had the first Women's Rights Convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And that came about because 2 women were denied the permission to go to an international women's rights convention, and so they decided to start one in the US themselves. They were 2 Americans. And so people at that first women's rights convention signed an agenda for women's rights. They wanted to make sure that there was equal treatment for men and women under the law, which there was not at that point, and that women would get voting rights. So those were kind of the things that they were really looking to support. 2 years later, the first National Women's Rights Convention took place in Worcester, Mass. And the next year, in 1951, Sojourner Truth, a former slave, delivered a memorable speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" in support of a women's right to vote and equality. So they started having these meetings every year. They were working towards this. And what happens in 1860? The Civil War starts. And the whole thing shuts down. during the Civil War. Nothing's happening during the Civil War. So everybody fights, kind of supports the war effort. When the war's over, it comes back up again at this point. And in 1868, the 14th Amendment is ratified, where citizens and voters are defined exclusively as male. So again, women are denied the ability to vote. It's only men at this point that are allowed to vote. So two major organizations are created to work towards women's suffrage. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony found the National Women Suffrage Association, which was more of a radical institution trying to achieve the vote through a constitutional amendment. Lucy Stone, Henry Blackwell, Julia Ward Howe, and other more conservative activists formed the American Women's Suffrage Association, and they were looking to amend the individual state constitutions instead. So from the very beginning, they were going at this from two different angles, either the federal, that would encompass the entire United States, or state by state. And so the state by state was seen as more conservative because each group could kind of work within their own context. A few years later, the first anti-suffrage party was founded. They were not in favor of women's suffrage, and so they started fighting against it. And this is going to continue all the way through until 1920. In 1878, Congress actually proposed a women's suffrage amendment. It was not voted on until 1887 and defeated. And that's going to become important, and you'll hear why in just a minute. In 1890, the two groups that had formed to fight women's suffrage, they joined together to create the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Stanton was the first president of this, and they decided to go the conservative route and really more focus on the state amendments instead. However, as you can see from this first picture, the Western states, they were busily making sure that women got the vote. So you can see, starting in 1869 with Wyoming, the Western states were allowing women to vote, and that included, until 1913, you can see Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Washington, California, Oregon, Arizona, Kansas, and Alaska all allowed women to vote. It was very different in the East, and particularly different in the South. The South was very against it. So in 1911, the National Association Opposed Women's Suffrage was organized. This was led by Mrs. Arthur Dodge, and its members included wealthy, influential women, some Catholic clergymen, distillers and brewers, urban political machines, Southern congressmen, and corporate capitalists. So you have people from all over the place who are fighting against suffrage. But they kept moving on. They said, we've just got to keep fighting for it, even if we're being opposed. So two parades in New York City happened in 1912 and 1915 in support of women's suffrage. And then, of course, the 1913 Women's March, or Women's Progression, was organized by the National American Women's Suffrage Association in March of 1913. They marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. This one is kind of the most famous one. This is the one that they modeled, the women who did a march several years ago, modeled on this one in 1913. The woman, Inez Milholland, who was a famous activist, speaker, and lawyer, she rode a white horse. You may have seen pictures of this, named Grey Dawn. She wore a white dress, a cape, and a golden tiara with a star of hope on top. And she led the procession. There were 20 floats, almost 8,000 people marching in the parade. They included suffrage leaders, bands. They had several bands that played music, representatives of various countries. Each state had a delegation, and professional groups such as teachers, nurses, librarians, lawyers, military office officials, students, business workers, and more all had their place in this parade. So it was huge. I mean, think about 8,000 people back in this time period. That is a big parade. Virginia was very well represented. They had over 100 people from Virginia be part of the Virginia state delegation. Janetta Fitzhugh was one of them. We have a record that she was one of them. In fact, I believe the newspaper article naming her as one of the delegates is over on the table there. Unfortunately, the police were not helpful. They allowed the crowds to kind of overwhelm the parade marchers. Some of the women were mishandled by people. It was really it was really sad. And they just didn't do a very good job. Fortunately, the Virginia delegates were able to complete their march. Not all of the groups were. Some of them were not able to complete it. But it was a big deal because it drew the attention of a lot of people. And that was what the whole point was to draw the attention of people to their cause. In 1916, Montana actually elected their first women to the House of Representatives. And it was that year that Woodrow Wilson finally started caving in just a little bit and went ahead and stuck on the Democratic platform to support suffrage. Unfortunately, that's all he did. He didn't really support it any other way. He didn't bring it to Congress. He didn't really talk in support of it very much. Now, of course, part of that is we're getting ready to enter World War I. Part of it was that he just was trying to be, let's see how this thing goes. And some of the more militant suffragists didn't think he was going fast enough. So they started picketing the White House. And they were called the Silent Sentinels. Unfortunately, the government officials were like, we don't want this to happen. This is a bad rap on us kind of thing. And so they imprisoned them in Occoquan. Yes. Mm-hmm. So the Occoquan workhouse was a place where they imprisoned some of the women suffragists in 1917. And it kind of culminated, there were over 100 people women who were imprisoned here. They had hunger strikes, they force-fed them, they mistreated them. And it kind of culminated in what was called the Night of Terror on November 15, 1917. The workhouse's superintendent ordered the guards to abuse 33 suffragists. They struck them. They bound Lucy Burns to her hands to cell bars over her head and left her that way all night. Women were seized, hauled away, hit, strangled, knocked down, squeezed, wrenched, and booted. So this was, like I said, this was called the Night of Terror. Well, what it did is, unfortunately for the anti-suffragists, this brought the sympathy of the nation to the cause of the suffrage movement, which was fantastic. And that combined with the end of World War I and the amount of amazing work that women did during World War I to support the war effort and to just kind of roll up their sleeves and get in there, those two things are what finally led Wilson to say, okay, fine. And he addressed the Senate about adopting women's suffrage at the end of World War I. So in 1919, the 19th Amendment was introduced. Now, remember that 1878 amendment that got shot down? It's almost word for word to the 19th Amendment. They basically just said, oh, wait a minute, we've tried this before, let's try this again. And it was passed in 1919 by Congress. And then it had to, of course, be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And on August 26, 1920, that is what happened. The final state for ratification voted for it. And that was the day, August 26, 1920, where women were allowed to vote finally in the United States on a federal level. So yay. All right, so let's talk about Janetta Fitzhugh, because she, as you hear, she's already setting herself up to be part of this whole thing. And she is from Fredericksburg. She is actually from Stafford. She was born on the 13th of April, 1866 in Stafford County at New Boscobel, which was one of the Fitzhugh properties. So it was one that her father owned, and that's where she was born. Her parents were William Henry Fitzhugh and Mary Ann Harrison Fitzhugh, his second wife. So her dad was a lawyer, and he's also listed as a farmer, possibly due to the size of his property in Falmouth at the time, and that was in the 1880 census. That's where we see them. Her middle name is not on any official documents, so she's Janetta R. Fitzhugh, but they think she probably was named after her maternal grandmother, Janetta Ravenscroft Fisher. So it's likely that her middle name was Ravenscroft, but we have nothing, I have found nothing to confirm that on a piece of paper anywhere. That's kind of scattered places, but there's nothing that we can confirm for sure. The family lived in Fredericksburg, and her father practiced as an attorney there. She was the fourth of 8 children. We don't know much about her growing up years, but she probably attended the public schools like her siblings did. And she had several socially and politically prominent relatives engaged in civic reform movements, and they are likely the ones who influenced her to become involved in her community, trying to make it better, trying to make it a better place for everyone. Oops, sorry. In fact, her father's sister, Janetta Fitzhugh, who was known as Nettie, was very active in different organizations, and some of those same organizations were ones that Janetta joined later on. She lived with her parents until the death of her father in the fall of 1882, after which she made her home with her widowed mother, Mary Ann Fitzhugh, and some of her sisters. In 1900 and 1910, Janetta, her mother, and sisters lived on Hanover Street in Fredericksburg. Sometime after her youngest sister's marriage in 1910, they joined households with the young married couple, and her brother-in-law, J. Conway Chichester, in 1911 built, one of the Chichesters, built their house at 1307 Washington Avenue, which is where Janetta and her mother and sisters lived with the Chichesters. And she lived there probably for the rest of her life. It's possible that she moved away by herself for a little bit, but for most of the time she actually lived with her sister and brother-in-law for the rest of her life. Her mother died in 1927. She never married, so Janetta never married. And so, like a lot of women from that time period who didn't marry, they would help with the family, but they would also go out and do things to help their community, and that is what she did. So she was a member of the Mary Washington Hospital Association. We think she started in about 1909 and worked through the early 1910s. She may have been second vice president of the executive board. That could have also been her aunt because they had similar names and it went back and forth, but we think both of them actually took turns doing that. It may be her involvement with the hospital, though, that led her to organize the founding of the Fredericksburg Civic Betterment Club in March of 1911. She was the first president of that club. And their initial focus was on garbage collection and public health matters. So this was a time when, health was becoming more important. A lot of the women's groups in Virginia and around the country were working towards better health, particularly for women and children, because it was being ignored. And one of the things that these betterment clubs would do would be to clean things up and to take care of garbage heaps and to get rid of flies that carry disease and things like that. So that is something that this club was trying to do. In 1911, one of the first things they did was sponsor an essay contest for children on the topic of the housefly, its danger to life and health, and how these dangers may be avoided.
Sounds sexy.
Not really, but important. In 1912, she was actually named one of the 5 delegates by the mayor of Fredericksburg to attend the International Congress on Hygiene and Demography in Washington, D.C. So you can see she's already moving herself up in the area as being somebody who's interested in the welfare of the city. When she came back, the club petitioned the city council to uphold its health ordinances. So they had health ordinances in place, but they weren't necessarily followed. And so the Betterment Club is like, no, you have to follow these. This is important for the health of our people. You need to actually do something about it. In May 1913, one of my favorite things happened. She helped to organize a fly-killing crusade. They awarded children who killed the most flies in a certain period of time. So the winners of the contest where Frank Hart and Robert Woody, between them, they killed almost 25,000 flies. Yes, yes. They counted them. They had to count them because that was how they won the prize. The newspaper article actually lists the number of the runners-up too, and how many flies they killed. So yeah, but the whole point was those flies were carrying disease, and they were trying to encourage people, you should be killing flies, not just letting them buzz around. And so that was their way of calling it to the attention. Of course, I'm sure the kids loved it. In 1913 and 1914, Janetta also donated money and spoke in support of causes she viewed as important. One of them was local farm demonstration work, but one of them was also the home canning and girls canning clubs. This was a way that working families could supplement their income, and that was something that she thought was important, is that the girls would have skills that would help supplement their income that they could do from home, because most girls and women were in their homes at this point. They weren't working outside their homes very much unless they absolutely had to. They did things, laundry in their homes or canning or other things like that. And she was very conscious of the fact that people needed to learn these skills, that this wasn't just something you could pick up, that you need to learn. And home canning, of course, could be dangerous if you didn't do it correctly. So they had these clubs to help make it safe and healthy to do this, and to supply food for their families and other people. I forgot to go here. So this is actually the hospital, the original Mary Washington Hospital is right there. So before we talk about Janetta's involvement in the fight for suffrage, which is what she's most known for, I wanted to introduce the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. I think only 2 of you had ever heard of it, so we're going to talk a little bit about it so you can get a feel for what it was like. It was important for the fight for women's suffrage. Women in the South had very few rights at the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, I think I told you one of the things that they were originally fighting for in the mid-1800s was equal rights for men and women. That's because women didn't have them. In fact, Virginia was the last state to allow married women to own property on their own. That didn't happen until 1877. So until 1877, if you were married in Virginia, you could not own property. Your husband owned it all. But that also meant that you could lose custody of your children. So if your husband decided to put you aside for whatever reason, he could put you in a home, like a mental institution, even if you're not mentally insane. He could do all kinds of things, and you could not take your children. If he was abusive and you left, you lost your children. So women had very few rights. And so this was something that women's clubs in Virginia were starting to work on by the end of the 19th century. They were trying to work on health, they were trying to work on rights for women and children so that they weren't being taken advantage of. So there had been suffrage clubs in the various southern states, but it wasn't until that National American Women's Suffrage Association became united that different states started forming their own suffrage organizations. In 1870, in May, the Virginia State Women's Suffrage Association was formed with Anna Whitehead Bodeker elected president. That was the very first formal suffrage group in Virginia. Unfortunately, they did not gain enough support, and they ceased to exist after only a couple of years. It was in 20 years before the next person tried. That was Orla Langhorne in Lynchburg. She began working towards forming a new suffrage league in Virginia. She attended conventions for the National State Women's Suffrage Association. She was the sole delegate from Virginia for years. And she did form a second suffrage league in the state, but her activities were mostly confined to the Lynchburg area. They didn't become statewide. Unfortunately, when she died in 1904, the whole thing dissolved, because she wasn't there to lead it. But the seeds of women's suffrage were being laid in these reforms that women were working towards. So women would form clubs, and they would work towards education, they would work towards better health, things like that. And so what happened was, as the women organized in these groups, women's suffrage started creeping into that. So you already had organized groups, And so as women's suffrage started popping up in some of these groups, that started giving them that organization that they needed, because that was part of the problem, is they didn't have the organizations. So they piggybacked basically on the organizations that were already being formed by women. In 1909, the Richmond Women's Club, which was one of these clubs that worked for women's well-being, they host a suffragist speaker from Kentucky. And then her visit led to several well-connected and well-known women leaders in the community to form the Equal Suffrage League in November 1909, and their headquarters was in Richmond, Virginia. A few of these women were Lila Mead Valentine, or Mrs. B.B. Valentine as she was known. She was an advocate for education and health reforms for women. Authors Ellen Glasgow, Mary Johnston, and Kate Langley Bosher. Artist Adele Clark and Norrell Houston, suffragist Anne Clay Crenshaw, education activist Mary Branch Munford, Dr. Kate Waller Barrett, who we will talk about in just a little bit, and Lucy Randolph, who was the great-great-granddaughter of George Mason. So these were important women with lots of connections, and they were part of one of these bigger clubs in Richmond, and they said, you know what, we're gonna start something, and they did. So Lila Mead Valentine was elected president. She served in that capacity for 11 years, so until 1920. Kate Waller Barrett was from Stafford, Virginia. She was the vice president. They joined the National American Women's Suffrage Association and became a vital organization in the South for women's rights. They organized to work at state and federal levels from the beginning, so they tried the two-pronged approach as well, and you'll hear in just a few minutes how that went for them. So their first public meeting was in 1911, and the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, Dr. Anna Howard Shaw, spoke at their first meeting. They managed to gather 120 members the first year. So Valentine and Johnston traveled all over Virginia, speaking on behalf of suffrage, but also supporting organized labor bills about juvenile delinquency and child labor. They were against bills that lowered milk purity standards and increased women and children's work hours in factories. So you can hear they were combining all of these things together. And so that gives them a voice. So they had personal friendships and wealthy supporters because of who they were and what their connections were. And that really helped to build the suffrage cause, and that is going to be especially important once opposition starts, which it will. So they held their first state convention in 1911. They had delegates from several Virginia cities. They had an independent suffragist from Fredericksburg. It was probably Janetta, because she was friends with Mary Johnston. She was personal friends with Mary Johnston. So it's likely that she attended just as an independent. They did not have anything in Fredericksburg right now. Unfortunately, even though they needed more members, the leadership did not reach out to the Black middle-class women leaders who would have been their natural allies. So the African-American community, they also had their own women's clubs, and to combine them seems like the natural thing, right? But they did not, unfortunately, and I will go into that in just a minute of why not. But the African-American club women went ahead and they created their own groups in support of suffrage and fought for them as well, and combined it with the things that they were doing too. Some of the women who were involved with that are Ora Brown Stokes, who actually lived here in Fredericksburg. Her father was pastor of the Shiloh Baptist Church Old Site, and then she settled as a teacher in Richmond. She was one of 2,410 American women to register in 1920 as a result of a voting drive that she helped lead. Josephine B. Matthews Norcom advocated for women's suffrage, and she spoke on the topic at the Virginia Federation's annual convention in July 1920, just before the amendment was ratified. Millie Lawson Bethel Paxton is credited with organizing Roanoke's first colored women's voting club. They inspired a reported 655 African-American women to register and vote in the 1920 election in Roanoke. Yeah, that's a lot, actually. We think that's not very many. Back then, that was a lot. especially because they had to pay a poll tax, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Emma Virginia Lee Kelly was active in many community organizations in Norfolk. She and other leaders actually faced illegal obstacles to registering to vote in 1920, and she hired a lawyer, went to court, and won. And so then she was able to helped her and some other African American women to register and vote in the November election. So more power to her. I was really impressed by her. In 1912, the state legislature of Virginia voted on the question of suffrage, and it was rejected, 88-12. Even though there were women there who were in support, there were actually men who were in support, they were like, no, we're not doing this. As a result of the vote, the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage formed. So now they've got somebody on the opposite side who's gonna fight them. They actually, that group actually brought in race into the issue, which muddied the waters considerably. And we'll, let's see, let me go ahead and talk about that really quickly. So they basically used white supremacy as a major argument against supporting suffrage because of the African American women who were going to get the vote, and that was going to double the vote against the white men who were in power. That was a big deal, okay? It's all about power. So, yeah, it was terrible. So the Equal Suffrage League released a flyer which claimed giving women the vote would not jeopardize white supremacy. They still did not reach out to African American women, which was really a shame. But it was kind of I think an argument internally. I don't know all of the details, but Mary Johnston actually wrote to Lila Mead Valentine and said, I think that as women we should be most prayerfully careful lest in the future women, whether colored women or white women who are merely poor, should be able to say that we betrayed them from freedom. So there was an internal struggle going on within the Equal Suffrage League itself. Because of so much of what people thought back then and the kind of arguments that were being used. And those were the same arguments that were against just universal suffrage at all back then. So these weren't new arguments, these were ongoing arguments that they were using against women getting the vote. In 1915, in December, their convention that year was in Richmond, and 200 delegates actually marched to the office of the governor, Henry Carter Stewart, to talk to him and try to convince him to support women's suffrage with the General Assembly. Janetta Fitzhugh from Fredericksburg actually spoke directly to him. She was one of the few that got into his office and spoke directly to him. However, he didn't listen to them. He refused to support it, and it was defeated again. By 1916, though, this is growing. This is a growing thing in Virginia. You have 115 local leagues already formed throughout the state. There was never, as far as I can tell, a Stafford County chapter. Citizens from Stafford County probably joined the chapters in King George, Prince William, Fauquier, Culpeper, or Fredericksburg. So everywhere around Stafford had the leagues, and it's possible that Stafford just wasn't, it didn't have a big enough population to actually have their own league, so they probably just went to the one that was closest to them. I know most of the people who were in Falmouth were part of the Fredericksburg one, as far as I can tell. So by this point, by 1917, you've got these different factions fighting within the Equal Suffrage League. They're realizing that the statement amendment is not going to happen. I mean, nobody's going to listen to them. They've tried and tried. And so at that point, they say, well, you know, let's just support the federal amendment instead, because it's obvious that the Virginia General Assembly is not going to do anything. So let's, instead of having this constant fight between two-pronged approach, let's just put all our eggs in that basket of the federal amendment. And so that is what they ended up doing after that. Unfortunately, the anti-suffragists then brought out the whole idea of states' rights as a way to fight it too. And then, of course, in 1917, we get into World War I. So the same thing is going to happen in Virginia that happens nationally, is that most of the women turn most of their energies towards fighting the war instead of suffrage. And so a lot of the leagues are going to lie pretty much dormant for the next year, year and a half, or something like that. In 1919, after the war ended, you had 32,000 men and women who were part of the Equal Suffrage League with 175 suffrage centers around the state. So even though there was some dormancy going on, you can see it was still growing. It didn't go away entirely, and it continued to grow. Unfortunately, Virginia was among the other southern states who were slow to implement the 19th Amendment and to vote for it. Lila Valentine actually died before she had the opportunity to vote, which was really sad. The Virginia General Assembly voted against the ratification of the 19th Amendment, but enough other states did vote for it so that it was declared in effect on August 26, 1920. The Virginia legislature then debated it twice more, once in the summer of 1919 and again in 1920. Robert F. Leedy of the Senate and Thomas Oslin of the House opposed suffrage and introduced a resolution against it in 1920, and both the Senate and House accepted that rejection. However, Senator Mapp introduced a resolution to allow women to vote only if the federal amendment received the 36 votes necessary to be passed. So they did approve that. I think they probably were thinking, oh, that's never going to happen, and so this is a safe thing to do. More fools them. So, so the main reason that the 19th Amendment was rejected by the Virginia General Assembly was due to the fact that politicians in power feared that women and African American voters would be in favor of reform, which the politicians had been fighting in the past, and they, in order to prevent that, to favor that status quo, they voted against it. So it was definitely a political power play by the Virginia General Assembly, and everything I've read about that all confirms that. So very sad. But after the 19th Amendment was passed, not much they can do. The feds say, nope, sorry. And the League of Women Voters at that point was then formed in November of 1920. So the Equal Suffrage League ceased to exist. The League of Women Voters took over all the things that the Suffrage League had done and kind of built on that foundation. Adele Clark, one of those artists that we heard about earlier, she was elected the chairman to replace the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. So any guesses on when Virginia finally ratified the 19th Amendment?
It hasn't yet?
It has.
1952.
1952, yes. February 21, 1952. It took them 32 years to finally ratify it and say, oh, well, I guess women can have the vote after all. Yeah. So let's go back to Janetta now. That was all about the Virginia suffrage. And see, she was very, very influential in it. And that's why I wanted to talk about that a little bit. So you had an idea of this is the context in which she's working for suffrage. Very conservative, I can send out the slides, by the way, for those of you taking pictures. So this was what she was best known for. So she was actually personal friends with Mary Johnson and her sisters. She would go visit them in Richmond. So she was probably knew about what was going on from the very beginning, even though she didn't do anything in Fredericksburg immediately. But in the summer of 1910, she and a friend actually donated 25 books on hygiene and morality to the new reference library of the Equal Suffrage League of Virginia. So you can see she is involved even before Fredericksburg is involved. In November of 1910, she visited Mary Johnston in Richmond, and that was probably when she first started talking to her about, hey, you think about maybe coming and talking to people in Fredericksburg about this, because she realized that she couldn't do it by herself. She was going to need support, and Mary Johnson was one of the ones who did that, and so that was the obvious person. And we think that's true because in February of 1911, just a couple months later, Mary Johnston was invited to speak to the Literary Society of Fredericksburg, which was, talking about Fredericksburg, the Freelance Star said it was the most conservative town in the South. So you can imagine how a lot of the citizens of Fredericksburg were going to take this women's suffrage thing. Later that year, Janetta attended both the National American Women's Suffrage Association National Convention as a delegate for Virginia and also the Virginia Equal Suffrage League Convention in Richmond. She may also have attended the 1912 National Convention, and she was definitely was a delegate for 1914 and 1917 conventions. On March 7, 1912, Mary Johnston came again to Fredericksburg, and Lila Mead Valentine came with her, and they spoke to a large crowd of both men and women at the Fredericksburg Courthouse. So there's the Fredericksburg Courthouse there. You can see this is the inside. It still looks like that. Every once in a while there's a suffrage walking tour, and they will take you inside there to see it. So they spoke to the Fredericksburg, they spoke to a large crowd, and it was exactly, Janetta presided over that meeting. They stayed with her in her house, and the next day on March 8, 1912, 8 women organized the Fredericksburg chapter of the Equal Suffrage League. So that was the first suffrage, official suffrage league chapter that was formed here in Fredericksburg, and it's going to continue on through 1920. So Ms. Janetta Fitzhugh was elected president, Virgie A. Lipscomb was vice president, and Dr. Ann Humphreys was the secretary treasurer. So Janetta represented Fredericksburg in the Richmond delegation of the women's suffragists at the Great Women's Suffrage Parade in March of 1913, as I mentioned earlier. So she was part of the Richmond delegation because Fredericksburg was so small. In December of 1915, she was one of the 200 delegates that marched to the governor's office. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of local records. They started looking for records of this in the 1930s, but by that point, a lot of records had been destroyed from these early years, including Fredericksburg's. Janetta, actually, we have the note that she wrote to Adele Clark saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't keep that stuff because I didn't have room." So it's we can only suppose from the few things that we have, plus what we have from some of the other counties, of the kinds of things that they would have done during this time period. But she increased the League's membership, so she obviously was doing something, because she started with 26 in May of 1913. She had 35, she only had 35 by 1915, but in 1918 she had 325. So you can hear the big jump in those years. So what was going on nationally was affecting Fredericksburg and Virginia as well, because you heard the big jump statewide as well. So what's happening is it's becoming more popular. Women are being seen as very important to society as a whole, and being seen more equal because of the work that they've done. And so that is going to be true even in little places, conservative little places like Fredericksburg. She apparently paid for local members' subscriptions to the Women's Journal, and like leading suffragists elsewhere in the state, she probably organized educational suffrage events at schools, churches, and county fairs. They circulated petitions for people to sign in support of women's suffrage as well. She had a bout of ill health in 1918, and she was not able to do a whole lot during that time, and of course because of the war as well. It's possible that the Fredericksburg chapter really just put all of their energies into the war effort, like most of the other places were doing. But after the war was over and the flu epidemic was over, Adele Clark reorganized the League here in Fredericksburg in July of 1919, and Janetta was selected president again. By that point, they had nearly a dozen men as members too. So you think of it only as women, but no, men who were sympathetic to the cause, they would join these the Equal Suffrage League chapters as well. In fact, her sister's brother-in-law, Richard Henry Lee Chichester, who was a circuit court judge at that time, he later became a judge of the Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals, but he was in support of the suffrage cause, and he was a member of the Fredericksburg Equal Suffrage League. So he put his money where his mouth was, which was really nice. Women get the vote, yay! So the senator and delegate from Fredericksburg voted against it, but the assembly, and even after the 19th Amendment was ratified in August 1920, the assembly did not submit the state constitutional amendment to voters, and so again, that did not happen until the 1950s. But that new Virginia law adopted at that session that allowed women to pay the required poll tax after the deadline, that had passed. They probably thought, no, that wasn't gonna happen, but it did, and so they were allowed to pay the poll tax and register to vote. So the poll tax was an amount of money that you had to pay, and you had to pay it every year in order to be eligible to vote, which automatically keeps people who don't have any money from paying that and voting. And there are a lot of women who could not afford to do that. We will see that most of the women who registered to vote either had family money or they had a profession. So there were a lot of teachers who registered to vote at the time, people who were nurses, who were clerks, who were in domestic service. They had the money. I believe they had to pay 3 years worth, because you have to be paid up for the last 3 years in order to vote in an election. So they would have had to pay a lump sum in order to register, but that law allowed that to happen, because usually you had to pay it by a certain date, but that law allowed them to pay that lump sum and register in time for the election, which was in November, just like it is now. This was back in September of 1920 that this was going on. So Janetta was one of the first women in Fredericksburg to pay the poll tax and register, and nearly 250 Fredericksburg women registered to vote during the first 3 weeks of registration. Unfortunately, something went wrong, and most of them had to re-register in early October. So apparently something went wrong with the whole thing, and so the newspapers, but give freelance credit, they say, they have in big letters, women, you gotta come back and re-register if you wanna vote. So there are articles day after day.
Yeah, was the poll tax universal or just Southern?
It was Virginia, I know. I don't know where else it was. I don't think it was universal, no. I think it was one of those ways of keeping people in line. Yeah, it was one of them. That and reading, being able to read was another one. There were lots of them, but the poll tax was the one that affected the women the most. So they had to re-register, but Janetta, and one of the papers I gave around, you can see Janetta's picture, and I will show you here as well. So in that first one, you can see her name circled, that she registered officially on October 2nd, 1920. According to the voting registers, Lillian Jackson, a 28-year-old teacher, was the first African-American woman to register to vote in Fredericksburg. On November 2nd, 1920, there were articles about how women had voted in the election for the first time. A good number, hundreds, came out to vote, which was great. Miss Betsy Arnold and Mrs. Feuerherd are mentioned as the first women to cast their ballot in Fredericksburg in the upper and lower wards. However, nobody mentions Janetta in any of these newspaper articles as voting. We're sure she did, but nobody mentions it. So she's not being recognized by what's going on at the time. In September 1920, Janetta Fitzhugh was one of the women appointed to the committee charged with organizing the Virginia League of Women Voters, but her involvement with the League is otherwise undocumented. She lived alone or with her sister and brother-in-law at 1307 Washington Avenue, which is right here, you can walk by it, until she died of cancer in Fredericksburg on the 16th of May, 1950. She's buried in the family plot at Fredericksburg Confederate Cemetery. So her family was originally from Stafford County. Some of the members of the Fredericksburg chapter of the Equal Suffrage League were also from Stafford County. I found them on the Stafford County census. But I want to talk about two other people connected with Stafford County who also contributed greatly to the giving the women the vote. Dr. Kate Waller Barrett and Thomas Lomax Hunter. So Catherine Harwood Waller Barrett was born in Stafford, Virginia on the 24th of February in the late 1850s. Her parents were Withers Waller and Anne Elizabeth Stribling Waller, and she was the oldest of their 10 children. She grew up at Clifton, her father's 1,000-acre estate near the Potomac River in Stafford County. The fishery that her father ran before and after the Civil War was one of the largest on the East Coast. They had money, they had connections. She was mostly educated at home, although she did have 2 years in the Arlington Institute for Girls. And on July 19th, 1876, she married Robert S. Barrett, an Episcopal minister who had recently arrived at the nearby Aquia Church. Between 1877 and 1888, they had 4 sons and 3 daughters. They lost one child, one son, when he was young. Soon after their marriage, they moved to Richmond, and one night a young, unmarried, pregnant girl who had been disowned by her family knocked on the Barretts' door. Kate, with her husband's blessing, took her in, beginning a lifetime of service to quote-unquote fallen women, as they were termed at that point. She determined to help them, and so she earned her MD at the Women's Medical College of Georgia in 1892 when they had moved to Georgia, and completed a nursing course at the Florence Nightingale Training School in London 2 years later, because she thought that the medical would help these women who were pregnant and they needed help. They needed help with babies, they needed help for their own health and things like that. In 1993, she opened a rescue home in Atlanta where unmarried pregnant girls could find refuge and receive care and education. And then she found help from Charles Nelson Crittenden, who was a New York millionaire, to support that rescue home. The following year, in 1894, she and her husband moved back to Washington, D.C. and settled in Alexandria soon after. She worked with Crittenden to establish the National Florence Crittenden Mission, which was the first philanthropic institution to be chartered by Congress. After the death of her husband, she continued in her important work, which led her to be recognized by national leaders. She was a delegate to numerous conferences and commissions, including being an observer at the Versailles Peace Conference and the International Congress of Women in Zurich. She also became a leader in the International Council of Women and was elected president of the National Council of Women in 1911. She served 2 terms as Virginia State Regent of the Daughters of the American Revolution, was a member of the Board of Visitors of the College of William and Mary from 1921 to 1924, was elected president of the Women's Auxiliary of the American Legion in 1922, and was made an honorary member of Phi Beta Kappa in 1924. Barrett was an active supporter of women's suffrage from the very beginning. She helped to found the Alexandria chapter of the Equal Suffrage League in 1912 and was the chapter's first president. And that chapter, but remember, she was the vice president of the Equal Suffrage League overall in Virginia. She attended the Virginia State Conventions in 1913, 1915, and 1919, and also attended several of the national conventions for women's suffrage. She actually, in 1916, gave a report on the attitude of the International Council of Women towards suffrage at the convention that year. She campaigned early in 1920 for suffrage ratification in Virginia, which, remember, the General Assembly refused. And later she was one of the founding members of the Virginia League of Women Voters. Her sudden death on the 23rd of February 1925 led to an outpouring of commendation and grief for the work she had done over the years. Newspapers from all over Virginia included obituaries, and many people attended her funeral at St. Paul's Church in Alexandria, as well as her burial at a quiet church in Stafford. And you can actually go to a quiet church. I'll show you. There's a plaque for her and her husband at a quiet church, which you can go see. The governor of Virginia ordered the flag to be lowered on the state capitol in Richmond at the very first time that a woman had been honored in that way. So she was the first woman to have that honor. A building at William and Mary, DAR chapters, and at least one library and school have been named after her because of all the great work she did to advance the health and well-being of women around the world. She was definitely one of Stafford County's brightest stars. Thomas Lomax Hunter was a lawyer and poet. He was actually born and lived in King George County. He was the son of Frederick Campbell Stewart and Susan Rose Turner Hunter, and he was a descendant of James Hunter, who is from Scotland. His father was a judge, and he received his preliminary education with private tutors, but then attended William and Mary College and Georgetown University, where he studied law. Hunter was admitted to the Bar of Virginia in 1908, and he began to practice in King George and continued there independently until the close of his life. During the First World War, he served as food administrator for King George County. Gardening and farming were his chief recreations. Between 1918 and 1920, Hunter represented King George and Stafford County in the Virginia House of Delegates. So he was the local delegate that Stafford County had at the time. He was a supporter of women's suffrage, compulsory education, and higher education for women, as well as an opponent of prohibition. He helped organize a chapter of the Equal Suffrage League in King George and was president of that chapter. He spoke in favor of women's suffrage, writing letters to other congressmen, writing open letters to be published in Virginia newspapers, and voting in favor of suffrage. He wrote, "He was an ardent supporter of women's suffrage, not because it is getting to be the popular thing, but because he believed women are really entitled to the ballot and would give a better tone to politics." So he really was truly in charge, in support of it. So in 1919, the Equal Suffrage League gathered they made these cards. You can see the card in the middle for Hunter, and they would tell whether they were in support of suffrage or against it, or maybe on the line, so they knew where to spend their time. I'm sure we do similar things now. So who do you lobby? You don't lobby the people you know are way against you, right? And you probably don't do a lot of lobbying for the people who you know are going to vote for you. It's that middle ground. Well, he was listed as somebody who was completely for women's suffrage and voted that way, and actually spoke to the General Assembly that way. So he wrote newspaper articles, he spoke different places in support of it. In fact, he was one of several speakers, including Kate Waller-Barrett and Mrs. B.B. Valentine, who spoke in favor of suffrage at the conclusion of the debates over the ratification of the resolution at the General Assembly. Of course, we know that they voted against it, but still, he was just like, no, I'm gonna still say something even if it goes against me. Mary Elizabeth Pigeon wrote about him in 1920, "To champion the cause of womanhood at the public hearing of this committee came many of Virginia's foremost citizens. From historic Stafford County, birthplace of Madison, Honorable Thomas Lomax Hunter, now in the House, was one of them." In 1920, he decided not to run for Congress, for the General Assembly again. Outside of his legal activities, his influence was felt in Virginia through his column As It Appears to the Cavalier, which he contributed to the Richmond Times-Dispatch from 1929 until his death. It was concerned with state and national affairs, and a selection of them were published in a book in 1935. He was a frequent contributor to literary magazines, but he was best known as poet. In fact, he was named Poet Laureate of Virginia in 1948 by the General Assembly. He died in Fredericksburg, Virginia on June 19, 1948. So you'll notice that among all the photographs I've shown you today, we don't have any of Janetta. With all of the information we've been able to gather on her life and her work, no one has been able to find a photograph of her. One of my colleagues created this picture to share on social media in the hopes that someone involved with the Historical Society somewhere might have a lead on who might have photographs. Seemingly ordinary people often support their communities in ways that make a great difference to many others, and then their names and their stories are lost to time. Let's hope that Janetta Fitzhugh is one woman who will be remembered for her contributions to the cause of women's suffrage here in Virginia and throughout the United States. So there are different places you can go to learn more. There's a handout back there that I created that will allow you to learn more as well. There's books and articles there. And if anybody is interested in getting an electronic copy of that with the links, you can give me your email address and I'd be happy to send it to you. Any questions? I ran a little over, sorry. Yes?
Has anybody given any thought to why the western part of the country went first?
Yes.
Okay.
It's likely because there weren't very many women. Women out there had to be really strong and really show their equality men because they had to do the same kind of work in order to survive out there. And so I think they were seen as equal partners much sooner there than on the East Coast, where women were still kind of the little women who stayed at home. It was just a completely different culture out there, and I think that's probably a lot of what it was. Yeah. Any other questions? Well, handouts are over there, and I will put a piece of paper out if you are interested in signing up for to get the handout. Okay, thank you so much. Yeah.
I just wanted to say to your wonderful talk, maybe you should add the picture of Cape Hall or Merritt Elementary in Stafford County.
Yes, you know, I had so much, and I ran over now, and I was trying to cut it down. So yes, that was one of the things I know. I thought about that because, you know, I was just like schools, and I knew everybody here would probably know that school. So yes.
Not our local area, but if folks are interested, there is the Lucy Burns Museum in Lorton. There's also a beautiful memorial up there in Occoquan Regional Park that was just memorialized, I guess, August 26, 1920.
Yep.
If you just want to pay a visit, you can learn more there too about the overall thing. Very fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It really is.
On that same note, the prison has an exhibit there on
Yes,
Suffrage.
that's where the Lucy Burns Museum is.
Yeah.
And I've seen that. It's really very interesting, very well done.
Unfortunately, it's only, I looked it up while you were talking, it's only open on the weekends, but still.
What's the
It's
name of the
worthwhile.
prison?
Occoquan. It was the Occoquan Workhouse.
Lloyd.
Oh, is it Lorton now? Okay, it was known as the Occoquan Workhouse then. I know the historic name, sorry.
That's okay, you were the only one who was looking things up. Every once in a while, you would say something and I go, oh, I need to know more about that. So, but nobody knows.
And feel free to email me. That's my email address right there. Feel free to email me if something comes up, or you want a copy of the slides, or you want a copy of the handout. And I'll put this here too if you prefer me to email you. So thank you so much.
Joy,
Yes.
this flag,
Yes.
was that for the suffragettes?
Yes. So the Historic Fredericksburg Foundation, Barbara Anderson does walking tours, and this is her flag, and this is her sash that she lent me for this. So we carry this around the city of Fredericksburg when we're doing one of those tours, and so then people can see, oh, what are you doing? So then we tell them.
So when the suffragette group segued into League of Women Voters, is that still the League of Women Voters flag? Or do you know?
I don't know that. I know that the original Equal Suffrage League had very plain sashes. It actually was dark with white letters from the pictures. And then so gold was one of the main colors, and then purple I think was the British color, and they combined them to kind of support the whole thing. So I think this may be a later sort of thing than right in the middle of the whole. I don't know the whole history of that. I didn't have time to chase that particular rabbit trail down.
It's okay.
But I know that the colors were different back then. The original pictures that you see, they have dark sashes with white letters for votes were for women in Virginia.
I just wanted to make a comment. The title suffragettes is a British title.
Yes.
When they started their efforts, and it was to denigrate
Yes.
women.
Yes.
So when it came to the United States,
It became suffragists.
they were suffragists.
Yes.
So just so everybody makes that mistake.
Yes.
So
I didn't know that before I started looking into this. Yes, suffragists.
They were more radical in English.
Well, we had the radical groups here too. So that was the thing is
Suffragettes were radical.
right.
Suffragettes.
Well, it just depended. There were different groups who did different things. So some of them were more radical. In fact, the ones who ended up in Occoquan were the more radical ones. Then you had the more conservative ones who wanted to fight for it but didn't want to go to jail. And that's okay. I mean, not all of us are meant to go to jail, and we can still fight for what we believe. Any other questions? Yes.
Was the Occoquan Night of Terror the only place that happened to the women, or was it happening in other parts of the country?
It's the only place I know of in Virginia. I have not looked at the rest of the country. I've mostly focused on Virginia. So. It's a big, big story. There's a lot to it, and I think a lot of it's not even known yet. I mean, I've been digging through old records to find a lot of this stuff. I spent a lot of time looking at old newspapers, for instance. It's not there. It's one book over there that the Library of Virginia wrote. Some people from Library of Virginia wrote to go with their We Demand exhibit that they created in 2020. And there's a lot of information in there, but that is more general for Virginia. So each little locality is gonna have their own things, which is what I was looking into. Someone like Kate Waller-Barrett was well known, there's a lot about her. There isn't as much known about Hunter. And Janetta was pretty much unknown. In fact, when I tracked down a family member, her great-grandniece, they had no idea. They had no idea that she had done that. So her great-grandmother had never said anything. She said even her mother, who would have known her personally, she probably died when she was maybe 10 or 11. She would have met her, she didn't know. So it was lost. It was lost until I started looking
Do
into
you
it.
know how Janetta Fitzhugh personally thought about Black women voting?
I don't. No, we don't have any of her words. We don't have any of her words. All of, we don't have a photograph either, and all of that I think is in family stuff. The great-grandniece said her mother has a bunch of family stuff and they're gonna try to look through it, but she has not. We've tried a couple times to, touch base with her, and it's the kind of thing where you can't like force somebody to do that. And we're just gonna have to, every once in a while we just nudge a little, hey, you found anything yet?
History buff.
Exactly, yes.
Just for some context though, I think it's Buffalo that both Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony were from, or up in that area. They were friends and neighbors. And the conversation about Black women voting and white women voting was a national one.
Yes.
It was a big argument between even between two friends that had grown up knowing each other. And it really, I believe Frederick Douglass's point was that while he believed in the right of women to vote, he thought Black men should get the vote first.
Mm-hmm.
So he was kind of against any women's right to vote until Black men were allowed to vote, and it became a big topic of dissension nationally.
He left the suffrage movement as a result of that.
Were there any additional rights that conveyed with granting the women the vote?
Any additional
Rights?
rights?
Yeah. What was there anything?
Oh, in the 19th Amendment? No.
No.
No, they fought for those rights, I think, more on the state level, or even local. Things like milk purity, that's more local. That was, if you think about that, that would be important, right? That your milk is pure, but that requires money from the government and inspectors and things like that. And, if people didn't want to put that money in there, then the milk was not going to get inspected, and so then you were going to have issues. So yeah, that was more, I think, on a local level. But see, women and children were not really being looked after. That's why women formed these groups, was because they weren't being looked after properly, and they were just like, well, let's organize and do what we can behind the scenes. But of course, that organization was very, very fruitful for suffrage as well. Thank you all for coming.